Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a truly fascinating historical mystery from the Jewish return from Babylonian exile. This is a story about the kind of profound, bedrock devotion of people who gave up absolutely everything for a place that, honestly, on paper, didn't even recognize them. It's a remarkable piece of history, and it really forces us to ask some deep questions about identity, sacrifice, and ultimately where our true worth is actually recorded. So, to really get what's going on here, we have to put ourselves in the historical mindset of the Israelites at this moment. Earlier histories, like the books of Kings, were constantly agonizing over the question, why were we destroyed? And that makes sense, right? Because those writers were right in the thick of suffering through the exile. But by the time we get to the book of Ezra, the whole focus shifts. They're finally returning home. So the new, burning question becomes, who are we? As these returning exiles are trying to rebuild their entire community from scratch, among mixed populations already living in the land, figuring out their exact identity was absolutely critical. And to claim a place in this new society, and more importantly, to claim an inheritance or a literal plot of land, the returning Israelites absolutely had to prove their ancestry. The primary focus for the returnees was rebuilding a pure community. That meant they needed to clearly, legally identify who actually belongs to the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. So what did they do? They started making these meticulous, incredibly detailed lists of specific families and genealogies to officially verify exactly who had the legal right to be there.
Right. Let's look at part 1, those who cannot prove.
Right in the middle of these obsessive genealogical records in Ezra chapter 2, the narrative just suddenly shifts. We are unexpectedly introduced to a group of people facing what can only be described as a devastating bureaucratic reality. They simply cannot prove who they are. We've got exactly 652 people from regions near the Persian Gulf, places like Tel Mela, which translates to Salt Hill, and Tel Harsha, meaning Forest Hill. They claim to be from the families of Deliah, Tobiah, and Nekoda, but their official status? Unverified descent. They literally couldn't prove their Israelite lineage. And if you think about it, it makes total sense. I mean, records were burned to ash when Jerusalem fell. After 70 years and 3 or 4 generations stuck in exile, a grandfather's knowledge was only half remembered by the father and pretty much completely lost by the son.
Which brings us to a really crucial question. Knowing they couldn't definitively prove who they were, and knowing they wouldn't get a guaranteed piece of land out of the deal, why would these 652 nameless people even bother making the grueling journey to Judah in the first place?
Let's just compare their options here for a second. Remaining in Babylon wasn't some kind of punishment for them anymore. Staying meant keeping their established homes, their livelihoods, their neighbors. It was the rational, comfortable, easy choice. Returning to Judah, on the other hand, that meant enduring a brutal, months-long desert journey. And for these 652 unverified people, they were walking toward a completely devastated land where they had absolutely zero guaranteed inheritance or property waiting for them. Since they had absolutely nothing material to gain in Judah, no land, no status, no big official welcome parade, their decision to leave behind a comfortable life couldn't have been based on calculation. It was driven by pure, unadulterated devotion. They just wanted to be part of God's community and help rebuild the temple, even if there was literally zero earthly reward in it for them.
Moving on to part 2, the paused priestly duties. So those 652 people weren't the only ones hitting this bureaucratic brick wall. We meet a second group facing an identity crisis that's arguably even more heartbreaking: the unverified priests from the families of Habiah, Hakkoz, and Barzillai. Now, the text actually notes that Barzillai took his father-in-law's name. Maybe he did it for some kind of prestige back in Babylon. We don't fully know for sure. But the result was a total disaster upon their return. They searched, but they could not find their names in the official registry. Because of this one missing bureaucratic link, they were instantly deemed unclean and legally unqualified to serve at the altar. Keep in mind, these specific families were likely acting as critical spiritual leaders during the darkest days of the exile. And now they are entirely stripped of their titles.
And to make matters worse, the governor ordered that these priests couldn't even eat the holy food, let alone serve in their roles, until a priest with the Urim and Thummim appeared. Now, these were sacred tools used by the high priest to discern God's will. The massive glaring problem here: their use had completely ceased since the fall of Jerusalem, and some historical records suggest they hadn't even been genuinely used since the days of King Saul.
So what the governor was really handing them wasn't just a delay. It was an indefinite and very likely permanent suspension. Waiting for these lost historical tools to miraculously reappear effectively meant a lifelong ban from the very identity and purpose they had clung to during 70 long years of exile. Imagine making that brutal trek home just to be told you're disqualified from doing the one thing you were born to do. So faced with this monumental rejection, completely stripped of their titles and barred from the holy food, what do you think they did next? Did they just pack their bags in frustration, turn around, and march right back to the comfort of Babylon? Nope, there is absolutely no record of them protesting, throwing a fit, or abandoning the mission to return to Babylon. Instead, they remained in silence, and they served. They chose to stay in this newly formed community and serve in whatever background capacity they possibly could, completely without official recognition or the glory of the altar. Which leads us to part 3, God's accounting. Now, this is where the narrative beautifully shifts from human ledgers to divine mathematics. The way the author of Ezra records the numbers here tells a massive story all on its own. Ezra records the total assembly of the returning community as exactly 42,360 people. It's a very specific, very deliberate number. And here is why that specific number is so incredibly important. God's math includes the undocumented. If you actually take a calculator and add up the individual verified family tallies listed earlier in the chapter, you actually fall short. The math doesn't work. But that final, precise total of 42,360, it mathematically includes those 652 unverified people, and it includes the suspended priests. Human registries and strict bureaucratic rules might have rejected their official status, but God's community counted every single one of them. They were not left out. All right, part 4, Devotion of the Nameless. Let's look at what happened next. If we turn over to Ezra chapter 3, it's the 7th month, the people have gathered, and the monumental task of rebuilding finally begins. And this is where we see the true, gritty character of these unverified returnees. Rebuilding the foundation of the new temple was not glamorous work. Not at all. It involved rebuilding the altar, laying these massive temple foundations, literally digging in the dirt, and moving incredibly heavy stones. And the people who couldn't prove their ancestry, they didn't stand on the sidelines sulking about their lack of status. They were right there in the dirt, doing the heavy, anonymous labor right alongside the recognized titled leaders. They worked entirely without titles or recognition.
Think of a modern skyscraper, or maybe a new hospital. When you walk into the lobby, you see those shiny commemorative plaques on the wall, right? They list the names of recognized leaders, the major donors, the lead architects. But the building itself isn't held up by a bronze plaque. It's held up by deep, unseen foundations laid down by the calloused, anonymous hands of laborers, whose names you will literally never know. The Second Temple in Jerusalem was built on the unseen foundation of these unverified, nameless, devoted workers.
And finally, part 5, Names in the Book of Life. This whole story brings us to a profound spiritual reality that bridges this ancient history to a timeless truth that applies directly to us today. Hundreds of years later, the Apostle Paul captures this exact same sentiment in Philippians 4:3. He writes, "Along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life." Notice how Paul doesn't bother to list all their individual names on the earthly parchment. He's highlighting that earthly registries and human shoutouts are just not the ultimate record of our devotion. Human registries absolutely failed the people of Ezra chapter 2. They lost their earthly titles, their land rights, and their priestly status. But heaven's registry, it did not fail them. Their sacrifices, their silent service, and their pure devotion were securely and eternally recorded in the book of life. And this ancient story maps perfectly onto the unseen devotion we see everywhere today. First, serving diligently without any earthly recognition or applause. Second, inevitably facing disappointments in human systems, ledgers, or organizations that just fail to see your worth. And third, trusting completely that God's warm gaze sees and remembers every single sacrifice. For anyone out there today feeling weary, invisible, or unappreciated in their service, whether that's in a community, a family, or an organization, remember that your anonymous dedication is what builds the very foundation of the community.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Take a look at your own life and ask yourself, where is your devotion being recorded? Are you exhausting yourself just striving for your name on a temporary earthly plaque? Or are you resting in the profound assurance that your unseen devotion is recorded forever in the only ledger that truly matters? Think about that for a while. Thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.